Welcome back to Culture Drop. I'm your host, Jed, joined once again by William Devitt, musicologist and David Johansen expert. Today we're tuning into the world of David Johansen, a musician who didn't just play with genre, he pulled it apart and reassembled it with soul and intent. From the snarling pulse of the New York Dolls to the lounge-lace swing of Buster Poindexter, Johansen carried a deep love for the music that came before him, and he found fresh ways to make it speak. David said, "I've always been interested in music that tells a story, songs that make you feel something, whether it's joy, rage, or just the truth." His voice echoed through punk, shaped artists like Mick Jones of The Clash, and his voice still rings out in the corners of music that aim to say something real. Let's get into it.
David Johansen is, to me, as important as David Bowie or Prince, or Joe Strummer, for that matter. So I'll try and be succinct in my observations.
Okay, so right there, you want to explain in as succinct a manner as you find suitable why you're making that statement?
Well, I got into the New York Dolls with their second album, Too Much Soon. My older brother Nick and Sean both had copies, and I actually didn't really get into their second album, or I'm sorry, their first album, their debut, the very famous one, until a couple years later, till probably 1978, after David Johansen's first solo album came out. To me it was just kind of like everything that I liked in pop music kind of wrapped into one bag. At the time I discovered them, the New York Dolls. I was probably 10 or 11, I guess. And I didn't understand what was going on, but it was a sound. Yeah. As I progressed and got my paper route and became 12 and then 13 and then 14 years old, the big touchstones for me had been, the Stones, obviously, but Bowie, particularly the Spiders from Mars albums with Mick Ronson. And Diamond Dogs as well, but loud, careening electric guitars.
But here's a question for you. Prince and David Bowie played an instrument. They wrote songs. Did David Johansen play an instrument? And did he write songs?
Oh, yeah. I played guitar, obviously, but, on record or live, generally not. He played, an acoustic guitar, through his career or whatever, but generally it's a accompaniment. But as a songwriter, I think he's non-parallel. There's very few people. He wrote songs, lyrics, and music. Often collaborated with people, with the Dolls. That would be Johnny Thunders, generally, one of the guitar players, and the other guitar player, Sylvain. Yeah. And when he went solo in 1977, he still collaborated with Sylvain quite a bit, but wrote most of his stuff. His first 4 solo albums to be 78, 79, 81, and 84, or pretty much, just him, maybe another collaborator. And then the Dolls, New York Dolls, Second Life, or sort of not reunion, but rebirth, more the spirit of the Dolls than musically sounding like the original Dolls. He collaborated almost exclusively with Phil Sylvain. But he was a tremendous songwriter, one of the great lyricists of our time. And I'm talking about, not just Lennon, McCartney, and Jagger Richards, or if you want to talk about these guys like, that Bob Dylan guy or that Lou Reed guy, or talk about like Gershwin. He had a pretty Catholic sense of music, or feeling for music. Catholic meaning universal, all-encompassing. I dare say Johansen was a genuine musicologist, which is, kind of a hefty word to throw around. You're supposed to have degrees,
Yeah, no, I would agree with you. You had sent me a link where he was talking about like his influences, and he was talking about the history of rock and roll, and he was going back to like the 40s, and then he wound it back to the 30s, the 20s, and he knows like the threads of rock and roll. Very interesting, well-informed guy on his musicology, and part of what makes him so interesting as a performer, I think.
Yeah. I suspect he probably had a lot of that knowledge even before he joined the Dolls in 1972. He was in some other, a couple other bands.
Sure.
The Vagabond Missionaries or whatever. It seems like he had maybe an eccentric home life. I guess, he's a pretty staunchly middle-class guy, a kid from Staten Island. His mom, I guess, she was an English teacher, and that scans because obviously, the guy's, when you listen to him, his lyrics, he's obviously very intelligent, very well-read, whatever well-read means. And his dad, there's some mystery about it. He was, I guess, an insurance guy, but his mom was Irish and his dad was Norwegian, and his dad apparently was an opera singer or something like that, or an amateur opera singer. Well, he liked opera, and I think I even read at one point that his dad was arrested for importing something like, I don't know, like many pounds of weed, of marijuana. And got arrested briefly. I don't know if that's just like an urban legend or just something that David made up, because David is, he was fun. He liked his tall tales. Whether he was really that, diverse and eclectic in his musical tastes and knowledge when he was, 19 years old or whatever, and, first, joined the burgeoning New York Dolls. I don't know. It's too bad the man never wrote an autobiography. Syl Sylvain has, and I still haven't read it. There isn't a copy in the Twin Cities library system, and I've been loath to buy one online just because supposedly it's loads of fun. And, well, in any case, the guy really had some pretty expansive tastes, and, he's most known for his rock and roll. And that's rock and roll, kids, not rock and roll. Now, he did do some rock albums when he went solo in '78. He's a little more rock music than the pure, rock and roll. And if you don't know the difference, I'm not talking to you, Jed. I'm talking to our several listeners out there everywhere. If you don't know the difference between rock and roll and rock, I'll find out. Now is not the time for Uncle Willie to explain it to you. So that's what got me into him. With the Dolls' second album, and I remember being at one of my older brother's houses. I was there to babysit one of my older sisters who was also living there. She just had her first child, and brother Nick came home and said, I heard the new David Johansen album, his first solo album, self-titled. And brother Sean said, what's it sound like? And Nick said, it's girls, which is actually one of the songs on the album, the second song on the album, which is actually should have been recorded for the New York Dolls, but they were disintegrating and breaking up. There's like a bootleg version of it, at least one that I know of. And that's 1978. What am I? I guess I'm 14, 15 at the time. So I want some of that. Girls. Well, oddly enough, the name of the song is Girls. It's actually a really, pro-woman, pro-girl, feminist kind of anthem. It rocks mightily, but it's just, well, that's the thing with the Dolls. And for a young guy, here's what David did better than anybody ever. And I'm talking about Jagger. I'm talking about Chuck Berry. I'm talking about Bo Diddley. He wrote songs about girls, and the sweetest and the most honest songs about girls and relationships. Love songs, maybe not so much, but, hey, a 2-minute and 58-second full barrel, 110 beats to the minute, rock and roll dance song can be just as sweet and tender of a love song as, some overwrought, ballad or something.
Yeah.
So there's that aspect. The New York Dolls represent to me LUV, baby, right? And that's what all the songs were about.
And just the visionariness of Johansen and that whole, and other people in the New York Dolls to be, so confident in the way they were dressing and their attitude, and that whole, was it the Mercer arts scene?
Yeah.
Kind of provided them with a hothouse environment for them to do this stuff. And it wasn't, unlike a lot of stuff today, it wasn't purely a drive to make money. They were generally making an artistic statement, flouting conventions, also creating really powerful, as you mentioned earlier, rock and roll. I really liked the sound of that first Todd Rundgren produced record. Just like I like the sound of that Transformer record by Lou Reed. There's something about 1972. It was somewhat glam rockish. It was some well-produced rock and roll. It seemed like different common people were doing some similar type of things around that time of 72.
Yeah, I think it actually came out in 73. I think.
Okay, 73. Yeah, 72, 73.
Yeah,
sure.
Well, no, I'm not splitting hairs. I know, Transformer came out in 72, but
right.
Lou had 2 albums, and first 2 solo albums came out in 72, and people just moved fast back then.
Yeah.
Not as fast as the 60s, probably, with the Beatles and the Stones. You have to have a new single out every 3 months, and,
right.
like that. But so I didn't mean to be, splitting hairs, because I actually associate the debut album with 1972 as well. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. Supposedly, a lot of real, hardcore Dolls fans, have had problems with Todd Rundgren's production and mix. I'm not sure. He didn't mix it. Jack Douglas mixed the album and ended up producing their Second Life debut album.
And Jack Douglas, of course, producer of Cheap Trick, produced Double Fantasy by John Lennon, his comeback.
Yeah,
Aerosmith.
He's a big name.
Yeah.
The music world needs ears like his. But I've always liked the sound of the album, but I kind of know what people are talking about. And apparently, there's apocryphal stories about the recording of the Dolls' debut. The Dolls, their friends were just coming in. It's recorded, I believe, at the record plant in New York City, and so there's just all kinds of hangers-on friends just hanging around, creating chaos and distractions during the recording. But then when it came to mixing, I didn't read this about Jack Douglas. I think Todd Rundgren has said all the band, the 5 band members were, no, make me louder, no, make me louder, no, and while they're in real time trying to mix the album. There are some things about Jerry Nolan's drums are mixed a little low. The guitars, it's a very cinematic sounding record. The separation isn't super great. Todd Rundgren ended up, I don't really know or even care about his solo work that much, but as a producer, he's made some of my favorite records, later on after 1973.
But all that aside, people say this, they say that. I mean, if you just turn it up loud, it's a great sounding record to my ears.
Oh, I agree with you. It's bright. It's got punch. Yeah, it's a desert island, record for me.
Yeah.
I actually like the second album. Well, they only put out 2 albums, originally, and so it's like picking your favorite child. And they're both radically different sonically. Yeah, to me, it's pretty much perfect. I do think it's one of those records that really, really would be a huge turn on for the music world in general to have a remix, an actual remix of it. Mm-hmm. That whether that would be Todd doing it himself, or Jack Douglas, or working in tandem, or getting a guy like Giles Martin to do it, but or Bob Clearmountain. But to actually do a full-on remix, but also to have, a full remaster of the album as well. The album's never been remastered, even for CD. There's some kind of small specialty labels, like I have a copy. I forget the label, but it's like the CD is black, like vinyl, and, comes in a hard, sturdy cardboard case, just like an LP, and it's very bright and very loud, not compressed, not brick-walled. And apparently, well, this might be boring to some of our listeners, but it's a process. It's not a remix or a remaster. It's a process whereby you take the stereo spectrum and stretch it like a rubber band or something, and then fold it in on itself. It's kind of like a really cool remaster, almost like a remix. Anyway.
Which album?
The debut album.
What, this is like a bootleg someone did?
No. It's a real record company. They've done it with many artists.
Okay.
The small specialty label, I'd have to look at it. Well, I've got it right here, but I have one as well, which is a Japanese import of a second album, which is some kind of remaster and just sounds like it's had, a shower and a shave and a new shirt. And the second album wasn't muddy, but sonically it was very different from, Todd Rundgren tended to get really bright sounds on his record. At least the ones that I know and love. There might be 5 of them.
Here's a little side thing, since we're starting kind of at the beginning of David Johansen's career. Do you know where the name The New York Dolls comes from?
Well, the New York Doll Hospital, yeah. Now, it was apparently across the street from their rehearsal studio, or rehearsal space, and Still Sylvain, Still Mazzari, is his real name, supposedly came up with the name. The Dolls previously were a band called Actress, and there's a listenable bootleg, studio bootleg called Actress from 1971, and it's Johnny Thunders, Arthur Killer Kane on bass, and the original Dolls drummer, the benighted Billy Murcia, and a guy named Rick Rivets on the second guitar. And you can hear some of the songs that appeared on the first Dolls album. In fact, even the second Dolls album, the Dolls were not very prolific for their 2.5 years. They were not prolific.
Let's back up for a second. You said New York Doll Hospital, that's just a matter of a fact thing, but that was actually, it wasn't like a human hospital, it was actually a doll repair shop, a hospital for dolls.
Exactly.
Which continued to be functioning as a doll hospital for several decades, until quite relatively recently.
Oh, really? I've seen a picture of it, like a contemporary black and white picture. There's some cars parked out front, and they're clearly, it looks like early 70s. Yeah, that's all I know about it is the story. And I've seen, I think, exactly one picture of it. But yeah, it was a doll repair hospital.
Yeah.
The thing about, say, the sexual aspect or sexuality or gender aspect, to me, is a little boring with the Dolls in their story, because it's just so oft repeated, and fortunately and unfortunately, in the times that we live in today, that whole idea is extremely front and center in the culture at large, in Western culture, specifically North American culture, about sexuality and gender, which it's maybe different, sexual preferences and whatnot. To me, it's kind of hackneyed. Oh yeah, we know, I know. Okay, right. I have always wondered how much thought the individual guys in the Dolls, original Dolls, thought about what they were doing, what they were portraying, and the implications, the sociological and dare I say, even back then, legal implications of what they were doing. I still don't have any real definite answers, and I've looked into, I've seen and read interviews with, all the guys in the Dolls, and it just doesn't seem to be that big a thing. They were music fans originally, but they were into fashion, style. I think there's a big distinction. I make a distinction between fashion and style, but they were into clothes. Sylvain and Billy Murcia briefly had a clothing shop where they actually made their own clothes. I think Truth and Soul it was called, and that was Sylvain's lineage from his family. He was an Egyptian Jew. He was from Cairo originally, Egypt.
Oh, interesting.
And his family moved to the U.S. mid-'60s, and they moved to upstate New York originally, Buffalo, and then moved to Brooklyn, and then moved ultimately to Queens, where he met Billy Murcia in high school, who was actually from Columbia. His family was from Columbia. And then, they ultimately met Johnny Thunders also, who was, from Queens, and went to the same school. But Sylvain's family were tailors. They made clothes. I guess in New York City you call it the rag trade. Sylvain was always into that, even until he died. He had his own line of guitar straps and hats, and his own custom made clothes. That he sold or commissioned. That's what they're into. You're talking about really young guys, teenagers, 16, 17, 18-year-olds. And the time you're talking about the end of the 60s and the beginning of the 70s, and brand new decade, and things are moving socially, things are moving musically. Some things are getting better, some things are getting worse. And so how much they actually, there's a lot of, talk, and it's kind of one of the ideas that the Dolls dressed like women. Well, Bob Gruen, famous New York City photographer, half the photographs you've ever seen, from, Lennon to Jagger, taken by Bob Gruen. Bob said he never saw any women dressed like that. He didn't know women who dressed like that. They were, do you know the term thrifting? People like to go to thrift stores and garage sales, something like that. It was like that. They just wore stuff because they liked it. And, later on, they wear their girlfriend's, clothing. And if you actually look at them, I think there's one, video, black and white video, where David Johansen actually did wear a skirt on stage. It was for a Halloween show at the Waldorf Astoria or something like that in 74. Other than that, it was just junk. It was just trash. It was just, they just wore just junk. The high heels and stuff.
Yeah.
Well, but women didn't dress like that. The hair, they all had, crazy hair and all like that. Well, yeah, I don't know, maybe some $5 hookers on Broadway and 14th Street or something had hair like that. Generally, it was just, so as you pointed out, and a lot of people have pointed out, there's a certain courageousness to what they were doing. But, how much of it was really premeditated, I think after when they first got their residency at the Mercer Arts Center, which is, a big drag, had a big drag bar. There are several bars and a couple different stages. And I'm like, hey, these people seem to like us, let's play this up.
Well, someone said they dressed like male prostitutes in one of the interviews that you sent me. I don't know who said that.
Right. Yeah, exactly. I wouldn't know. I wasn't in New York City in 1972, so I couldn't say what the Red Boys were dressing like back then.
Ultimately, if we don't know, we don't know. We've got a lot of... we don't want to spend too much time on it because we have a lot of career to cover for David Johansen.
Well, Right. But it's a big part of their story.
Sure.
And for me, it's just like they always just looked like. I mean, that first album cover, the cover of that, it's like okay, and they were really making a statement with the cover, and that's probably one of the reasons it sold so poorly. In Cream magazine that year, which I ended up reading, semi-religiously for years after that. They were voted best new band and worst new band simultaneously. And Cream was pretty influential back then. Yeah. As influential as Rolling Stone magazine.
The other interesting thing is news footage, where the reporters are talking about the New York Dolls from that thing you sent me where they talk about Iggy Pop.
That's Bob Gruen's film, The Photographer.
Okay, right.
All that is the name of the film.
Yeah, it's just how much the culture has changed. You get a sense watching those reporters kind of go back and forth. Like, this was still somewhat shocking stuff at that time in New York 70. Like, it was hard to hear the music because of the way they were dressing. Whereas today, all that stuff is kind of coming back, I guess, in a way, in terms of it being controversial. But there's so much water under the bridge. Like, we can just hear it as great music. You were alluding to, like, how they're dressing. It's like no big whoop, whatever,
I've never seen it that way or felt that way. And I feel, especially now, being older, it's very courageous and, the solidarity with, gay rights and transgender rights, all, the whole LGBTQ movement. I understand that and I applaud that, and that's great. At the time, it didn't seem that way. Just like, why are these guys so much different from, say, Bowie, David Bowie, and Ziggy Stardust, Spartacus from Mars band.
Exactly.
Or, for that matter, the seemingly, comparatively butch Rolling Stones.
Who also dress like women in some of their videos.
Like women? I don't know. Again, I never saw any women that...
The Some Girls cover, right?
Well, that's a joke, and I actually got sued for that, and the album has changed because I actually got sued by a couple of people, Farrah Fawcett Majors being one of them. I'm talking about on stage and for publicity.
Yeah.
The faces, Butch, Rod Stewart. He's the guy that invited them to London to open for the Faces in 1972 before they recorded a single note other than a couple demos, which have, since been released, and which unfortunately killed their original drummer, Billy Marcia, who OD'd, and then, some friends tried to literally pour, coffee down his throat in the bath, threw him in the bathtub. Well, he drowned. That was Carnes. The inquest said he actually drowned. Mm-hmm. But it was Rod Stewart, on behalf of the Faces, opening for the Faces, the Dolls, at Wembley. And they'd never been outside the country. Sylvain had been to Amsterdam, and Johnny had been to London, like as kids, like when they were 17 or whatever. Yeah. But, Sylvain had been all around the world. He lived in Paris before, after moving from Cairo, his family moved to Paris, and then to the U.S., to New York State and then New York City. But my point being is that the Faces were as outrageously dressed and would become even more so after 72, 73, 74, 75, just as the Stones would, or Mott the Hoople, another butch band, solid working class following. And we're about to break up, and Bowie intervened, gave them the song All the Young Dudes, produced their comeback album in 72, All the Young Dudes.
Yeah.
And Mott the Hoople started wearing the platform shoes and the flashy... It was a glam, is what people would call it. Some people call it a glitter, some people call it glam. My point in bringing all these different, bands and artists up is that the Dolls don't look visually at the time that much different from a lot of these people. The same thing was going on, say, with black artists and acts at the same time for R&B.
Sly and the Family Stone.
Just for example, Parliament, Funkadelic, George Clinton, Bootsy Collins, they had their thing going, and it was all very glamorous.
Yeah, it was in the culture, but can we say the New York Dolls were kind of like the instigators of that? in the rock and roll era?
Probably. Bowie saw them in New York City.
Oh, he did? Okay, well, there you go.
About 71, and Bowie still had really long hair, like he has on the cover of the Hunky Dory album.
Okay, well, there you go. That's a strong argument right there for...
He went back to London, and suddenly he became Ziggy Stardust.
Wow.
He saw the Stooges, he saw the Dolls, and, the Dolls didn't have a record out or anything. But, Bowie was like that. He was a sponge for culture, for ideas musically and sociologically.
Well, I didn't realize that. That is very fascinating, because that Ziggy album is very much kind of a mashup of the Stooges and the Dolls in a way. And other things.
It doesn't sound like the Stooges at the time. The Stooges were actually breaking up at the time, and Bowie would, like he did with Martha Hoople, revitalize them for exactly one album. And the band would change, the personnel would change slightly, and he would produce the album Raw Power, which was released in 73.
Right.
Which sounded very different from their first two albums. But it wasn't just, the Stooges and the Dolls influence. Bowie was heavily into the Velvet Underground.
Oh, sure.
Covering a couple Velvet songs with the Spiders from Mars.
Yeah.
And then would go on to, produce Lou's second album, his big breakout album, Transformer.
But from a fashion perspective, what Bowie would do after he saw the Dolls, that's a fascinating influence right there.
Yes. And a big thing, fashion and style. As I've said, I make a distinction, but and presentation, just overall presentation, presenting yourself. Not just publicly, but privately as well. So Bowie was, very influential in that regard as well. The thing is, the Dolls were already just these, not dumb kids. They're actually generally highly intelligent and intuitive kids, but just rock and roll music fans from the outer boroughs of New York City. They were the all-borough all-stars. David Johansen from Staten Island, Johnny Thunders and Sil Sylvain were from Queens.
Yeah.
Arthur Killer Kane was from the Bronx. Original drummer Billy Mercia was also from Queens, and Jerry Nolan, who really kickstarted the band, was from Brooklyn. He was an Army brat, so he traveled around the country. His dad was a U.S. Army officer, but Brooklyn born and raised. They were just kind of, music, they're very young,
Yeah.
And they're all had been in bands and were trying to get bands, and, they're just struggling. They just kind of, it seemed to me, lucked into this Mercer art scene. Their first gig was a homeless shelter, around the corner. And they just kind of lucked into that scene. They were too late for the Warhol factory scene, but the Velvets the Velvet Underground were part of. And, they're all, outer borough, kids, none of them, from Manhattan.
Were they part of the Warhol scene?
No.
Which is interesting, because you could just see them fitting right in a lot of ways.
Right. I'm sure they, had contact, as they, their reputation, got bigger and they started to play, around the city. This is before their, debut album, came out. So yeah, I don't know if you just want to move directly into David's solo career.
Sure, if you want to.
The Dolls would more or less disintegrate. They released a second album, which to me I may prefer. It's the one that actually turned me on to them. Titled "In Too Much Too Soon," as in a movie. In Too Much Too Soon, which is the proper name of the album, but it actually says "in" on the album cover. Almost half the record was covers, and the thing with the Dolls, and particularly David Johansen, is he just had impeccable taste in music. And so, like, every cover... Now, the first album, there was only one. It's Bo Diddley's Pills.
Yeah.
And on the second album, of the 10 songs, there's, 4 or 5, almost half the album. And in, subsequent years, from my youth, when I was in my youth, I've heard them all, and essentially the Dolls versions I consider vastly superior. Archie Bell and the Drills, There's Gonna Be a Showdown. I forget who the original Strand in the Jungle was done by, but these are little, 3.5 minute mini, but it's like West Side Story. They're theatrical, and they all sang. David Johansen, Johnny Thunders, and Syl Sylvain both had very distinct voices and vocal parts.
I think my favorite song on this album is Johnny Thunders singing Chatterbox. I just think it's so cool.
Oh, it's a great song. He would, play that, for the rest of his career. Sometimes under different names. Milk Me, The Milkman, recorded on his solo debut as Just Leave Me Alone.
Another revelation to me is, listening to these albums this week, is they do a cover of Sonny Boy Williamson II's "Don't Start Me Talking," which I became familiar with because Dylan did a cover of it on the David Letterman show. Remember that?
Yeah, was that Dylan's Letterman show? Was that when he was promoting the Infidels album?
That's exactly right.
84? With that, he rolled into town, got this band. They had no rehearsal, a young, 4-piece band.
Yeah.
That's right, yeah. That's right. And Bob can't play the harp. He's like, he picks up like 3 different harmonicas.
Yeah, he picks up the harp in the wrong key. Right.
And, it's hard to beat Sonny Boy's original, but the Dolls just make it their own, kind of like the Stones would do.
Yeah.
When they got a hold of a cover, they made it their own.
Mm-hmm.
That's one of the songs, one of the covers. That's 3 right there. Bad Detective, I can't remember who that was originally.
Bad Detectives was a Coasters cover.
Oh, that was the Coasters? Really? That doesn't surprise me. Yakety Yak, and, you kind of considered like a fun, gimmicky kind of band.
Mm-hmm.
That makes sense. The Coasters, sure. And it's hilarious. And they all had the different, Johnny Thunders, hey, New York, that wine. And Syl Sylvain had his Earth Angel harmonies, stuff, and they just worked so well together. They were kind of the perfect pop band. They were the perfect boy band. And this means the Beatles, this means the Stones, this means, dare I say, the Monkees. The Dolls were better at that than all those bands. Each band member had his own distinct personality musically. never mind visually, and then sort of aesthetically. And it can't be, stressed enough what Jerry Nolan did when he came on after Billy Murcia died in London, 72. And they were going to break up. And they all knew Jerry, who was, several years older than all of them.
Yeah.
And he was a professional drummer by that time. He'd been playing with Susie Quattro and actually with Gene Krupa, who was actually his mentor. He took drum lessons from Gene Krupa.
I was just looking at the birth dates of Johansen. Johansen was born in 1950. Nolan was born in 46.
Yeah. So he was older. And he got his start actually playing in strip joints in Oklahoma, at Fort Sill, I imagine, Oklahoma, the armpit of the U.S. Army, apparently, when he was like 13 years old. So he had that whole rhythmic thing, that timing. He acted like traffic cop for the band. Mm-hmm. And you can listen to the demo sessions. There's two of them, professionally recorded. Billy Murcia on drums. And the songs are there. David's voice is getting there. Johnny's guitar is getting there. Okay, this is good. When Jerry Nolan joined the band, everything became supercharged, and he acted as a traffic cop. All the stops and starts and breaks and accents. And so, people, call them the New York Dolls proto-punk. Like they're talking about the Ramones, and the Ramones could really play, but they were, pretty sonically, pretty one-dimensional, generally. Mm-hmm. The Dolls were completely three-dimensional, and rhythmically, I'm talking about on the dance floor, very three-dimensional, very funky, very swinging, and that's all down to Jerry Nolan's drumming. I'm a drummer, so that's really, because the rest, Jerry was the only professional at that point. Syl Sylvain was an excellent guitar player, very controlled, and had excellent, always played with a clean tone versus Johnny Thunders, who always had a very dirty, distorted tone. But Jerry was the architect. He reimagined all those songs for 2 albums worth. And like I say, they weren't very prolific. They relied heavily on cover songs, but the way he orchestrated those songs. Anyway, I forget how he got Jerry Nolan, but that is a very important part of the Doll sound.
I was just curious what happened to the Dolls after that 4 years from the release of their second album to David Johansen's first solo album. And it says here that 75, Johnny Thunders and Jerry Nolan left the band. Johansen and Sylvain kept the band going with other members until 1976, at which time Johansen embarked on the solo career. His first 2 solo albums, the eponymous David Johansen and In Style, featured several enduring originals.
The Dolls broke up, essentially. Malcolm McLaren came over from England. He ended up going back to England and forming the Sex Pistols, which not really, because Steve Jones, Paul Cook, and Glenn Matlack were already a band, but getting John Lydon, a.k.a. Johnny Rotten, to sing and write lyrics was based on the Dolls. And Malcolm, he just drove him into the ground. He had him dress up in red patent leather, had a big Chinese communist flag as a backdrop on stage. They went down to Florida, playing just boondocks, and the Dolls had their original contract with Mercury Records that they would never open for anybody. They were always going to be the headliner.
That's what the Police did.
Touring with Leonard Skinner, of all people, who were just, getting started. Apparently, they were great buddies. They got on great.
That's an interesting power move, not opening for anybody. That's what the Police did as well.
That speaks to a lot of the Dolls' hubris and arrogance that they had. They get their upfront money from Mercury Records, and they go and buy all the brand new guitars and equipment, Les Pauls, and various Gibson guitars, and then after the second album, after '74, Johnny and Jerry would spend their money on drugs, but they they booked themselves into, 4-star hotels, and they were basically behaved like rock stars, which they were in the truest sense. And this didn't work well. And, playing with, Leonard Skinner opening for him, I guess they got along so well. Apparently they both, drank had similar drinking habits. They never recorded a third album, even though they had material for it. And several songs that the Dolls were playing in their final year of 1975 would end up on David Johansen's first debut album, 78, and Syl Sylvain's debut album the following year in 79.
Mm-hmm.
The Dollettes that David and Syl kept going for another year, I still never heard. I'm sure I could find it on YouTube or whatever, but I've only heard a couple tracks, and they sound fine. Just not the musical personality of the Dolls. Syl's, he's a great guitar player. Not a distinctive guitar player, not a true stylist like Johnny Thunder is, but a very fine guitar player and a great onstage foil, a great performer. And that's the thing with the Dolls, the original Dolls, is that music, for me, and I think for a whole lot of people who like them, you could get off on all their instrumentation. You could listen to a song, but you could actually zero in on, I don't know, if you wanted to smoke a joint or whatever, you could zero in on Sylvain's guitar parts, or Johnny's guitar parts, or Jerry's drumming, or Arthur Kane's. Often he had some great bass lines, but he was the least musically accomplished. Uh-huh. He had this leg behind him. So there is Arthur playing like Jerry and Johnny doing the speed thing, and then Arthur lagging with these big, heavy, clunky, clumsy bass lines. And then Sylvain on primarily rhythm guitar, although he has some great fills and leads as well, kind of acting the glue that glued the Dolls' sonic attack together. Mm-hmm. Just a great band. I have to go off on this stuff, Jed. I hope this doesn't get lost on our non-musician listeners. But that's the thing, is that sonically, not just philosophically and sociologically and all that, sonically, the Dolls were, to me, one of the greatest rock and roll bands ever. After they collapsed, Jerry and Johnny walked away. They need to get back to New York City to score dope, because that had reared its ugly head. David took a year off, met some guys from on the Staten Island ferry, some homeboys from Staten Island who had a band. Fuzzy Verno on bass, Frank LaRock on drums, Thomas Trask and Johnny Rayo on guitars, and said, "Yo, David, we hear you're looking for a band. We hear you're looking for players." And he said, "Yeah, kid. All right, kids. Yeah, maybe." They got together. They did some jamming. The band worked really well, and David had mostly some new songs, a couple of songs from like Funky But Chic and Girls, which were at the tail end of the Dolls, and went into the studio with Richard Robinson producing, who famously produced Lou Reed's debut album, 1972, and later would produce his 1978 album, Street Hassle. And his wife, Lisa, was a big music journalist. And I mean, a real music person, not just like a jerk-off journalist, but a real music person. And she's widely loved and respected by real rock and roll people around that time. Wrote for Cream magazine, Circus magazine, Parade. And her husband, Richard, produced David Joe's debut album. And it's a stone cold classic. David's voice has actually improved. If you can't, he's one of the great screamers of all time. He's up there with Little Richard. He's up there with Otis Redding. How you survive the Dolls and your voice actually come out better, I don't know. But the band, they didn't have the musical personality of the Dolls. It's very solid commercial stuff. Like, it's not slick.
Yeah, it's a great record. I wasn't that familiar with it until doing my homework this week, but I love this record.
The dude's humanity is naked. It's up there for the first time. It's not surrounded by the other guys in the Dolls and by their their legend and the reputation and the sonic distractions of Johnny Thunders and Jerry Nolan, and just how can you top those two Dolls albums? You know, yeah, I'm talking like a fanboy, but I'm talking seriously as well. Well, he didn't top it. He didn't top it sonically, music, but it was a push in the commercial direction, and I'm sure it got airplay, not just on the East Coast or the tri-state area or whatever, but it should have been, like, there's only 9 songs on it, and they all could have been on the radio, you know, FM radio at the time, which wasn't, you know, the stupid classic rock format that it is, you know, today. And they toured with that, and live, they were probably even better. An promotional album, about a third of a show from the Bottom Line in New York City came out in 78 just for radio promotion. The entire show was later released on CD in, I think, 1992. And it just shows you just the massive, way too much fun that you should be able to have legally. You know, David's interaction with the audiences and his raps and his talking, and, you know, Sylvain, of course, who was sort of his, not maître d', what do you call it, consigliere, how do you pronounce that word in Italian? Like Steve Van Zandt is with Springsteen. What do you call that? Consigliere? What's the word? I can't pronounce it.
Sidekick?
Sidekick is, thank you very much. Sidekick. They recorded a second album in 79, Mick Ronson producing. And it's basically the same band, and again, a couple songs co-written by Sylvain, at least one of which was a late era Dolls song, earmarked for the Dolls, what would have been their third album, Reckless Crazy. But a very different sound and different flavors. Mick Ronson gives them a big, spacious, open sound, very live, and sort of compressed, very rock sound of the debut album. And like, there's a reggae number, you know, bad reggae, played by the Staten Island Boys, but hey, it's reggae, and it's close enough for David Joe. A pseudo disco number. Remember, disco was still a thing in 79. It's not really a disco number. It's if it was, great, you know. Swahili Woman, big dance song. The thing is, the guy's humanity is coming out, which was kind of subsumed in the Dolls. As sort of, people who weren't listening or paying attention might say, oh, it's nihilistic, or it's, you know, it's anger or something. No, they weren't at all. They weren't the Stooges, and they weren't the Velvet Underground, and they weren't the MC5. They were full of David's lyrics. LUV, and it was getting more so. And again, the In Style record from 1979 should have been, there are many songs out that just should have been on the radio. You know,
yeah.
The sound was there, the production was there, the different styles and flavors were there.
Melody.
That's their tribute to not just Motown, but specifically the Four Tops.
Yeah.
You know, it features, you know, Mick Ronson was, you know, great arranger and a great string arranger, which he'd been doing with Bowie in the early 70s with the Spiders.
And one thing, kudos for Johansen, he had this chameleon-like ability to be relevant in different stylistic eras. You know, like Bowie could do it. A lot of bands kind of get stuck in one era, right? And they never get out of it, whether it's the 60s or glam. And, you know, you see David Johansen on the cover of In Style, and it's like, yeah, he's ready to go. He's still relevant. He's doing a new thing here.
That's a disco. That's David at the Disco.
Yeah.
You know, those shots on the cover.
Sure.
Well, that just speaks to his musical Catholicism. You know, that's just what the guy was into. The guy was into music. He's into presentation. He's an obvious extrovert. I think kind of like the Dolls, who just assumed the position of rock stars.
Yeah.
As, you know, young, you know, people just getting out of their teenage years. David, I think, just assumed the role of rock star solo. rock star.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, why can't I be up there with Rod Stewart? You know, he just assumed that somehow, and the personality comes through. So the lyrics tend to be more on the personal side, but just equally as funny, as compassionate, as insightful as a person can write in pure doggerel without, being Bob Dylan pretending to be a poet or whatever. Sorry, Bob, but, pure doggerel in the classic songwriting tradition of, the great American musical traditions, encompassing all the uniquely American music styles. That's, David had command of, and so he was able to write lyrics in that tradition and make them poignant and unique and funny and compassionate and empathetic and rousing and bawdy. The guy, he just had, he's just one of the great songwriters. I just, kind of dissed Dylan, who I'm a huge fan of. I didn't really mean to diss Dylan. I just meant to say that David Johansen, in his own right, is on a level with Dylan. And Dylan, for the pure, Dylan isn't George Gershwin either,
Yeah. Another thing is, I notice the writers on this album, a lot of the co-writes are with Sylvain.
There's a couple on the first album. On this album, a couple of them. Sylvain would be the musical side of it.
Okay.
And so that's the thing, is that Sylvain had a very catchy sense with a melody, just as Johnny Thunders did. And the thing with Dylan, and you can edit what you see fit out, not knocking Bob. I'm saying I'm using Bob as the standard, as the gold standard.
Yeah.
What I'm saying is that the way with the melody, a catchy wham bam thank you ma'am song, is what David specialized with, especially when he's working with, say, Sylvain or early on Johnny Thunders.
Yeah.
Whereas Bob is not really known for his melodic, his catchiness. The catchiness in Dylan, from whatever era, tends to be from his voice, from the words, from whatever band he's working with, or whatever musicians he's playing with. It's not generally get off your ass.
This is more like economical songwriting in a way, the Johansen.
Yes, thank you. Very well put. Yeah, I think that's what they call doggerel. Well, you could look up the word doggerel. I think I have before. I think I know what it means. And so, no, I'm not saying David is a poet in the sense that Dylan is, although, hey, poetry, that's a pretty big, it's a big church, so it's a big umbrella, who's to say what's poetry and what isn't? David's, to say he's maturing as an artist around that time, that's certainly he was, but his sense of fun, his sense of possibility, of, hey, let's do something. Let's make something happen. That's the first time I saw him on September 12th, 1979. It's opening for The Clash at the old St. Paul Civic Center with his original Staten Island band with Sylvain on guitar and piano and general court jestership. The opening band was the Undertones from Belfast, Derry, who I hadn't actually heard yet, blown away by them. But I was super geeked on The Clash, and had everything, as I would remain to be, to this day. But I was super geeked on David Johansen, the Dolls, and Johnny Thunders, and the Heartbreakers, and so it was just like the perfect show, for 15-year-olds. 15-year-old me.
Yeah, amazing.
The next album would be Here Comes the Night, and that came out in 81.
Right.
And even more so, it's even tighter and more compact than the debut album. Again, every song could have been a top 40 radio hit at the time.
Yeah.
It's just very sleek and streamlined. Small band, just one guitar player, Blondie Chaplin. I don't know much about. He toured with the Stones, for some of the century, about three tours, doing backup and occasional acoustic guitar and percussion. And I think he played with the Beach Boys at some point. He's a South African guy, not an Afrikaner, an actual South African.
Yeah.
And great guitar player, and he's the sole guitar player on the Here Comes the Night album. Tony Machine is the drummer, and he was from the Dolls. He was in, I think, an office guy in the Dolls organization when they were actually signed to Mercury Records for their 2 minutes of fame. He's a great drummer. He ended up being the drummer in Buster Poindexter's Banshees of Blue band.
Oh, okay. So he was a literal drum machine.
Yeah. I guess that's his real name, Tony Machine.
That's great.
And Ernie Brooks played bass. All I know about him is that he's the bass player in Jonathan Richman's Modern Lovers.
Oh.
Their debut album, which is one of the great albums of all time.
Yeah.
And that's all I know about him. And other than that, you get Tommy Mandel. He's just wonderful New York City session man on occasional piano in Oregon. I think it was produced by a guy who I think, Barry Moraz or something like that. I think he produced Styx, the band Styx.
Yeah.
But I think he was the guy who produced, maybe engineered the album. And 81, that Chevy Ben is just like... And so he toured that. He got a slightly different band, 2 guitar players, Hugh Gower from the Scottish band The Records, who had a great single with Starry Eyes, played a left-handed Les Paul, and Tony Machine on drums, and just some random guy on bass, random guy on second guitar. And they toured that. I saw him twice on that tour. In 82, they released the Live It Up album, which became a big deal, and actually I think the biggest seller of David's solo career with their Animals medley.
That was as I told you the other day, that was my entry point to David Johansen, because they're playing that in high rotation on MTV when they didn't have any American-made videos yet, really.
Yeah, I didn't know anybody really at MTV at the time. But he even got some airplay on, the horrible local classic rock station, KQRS here.
And today, I have to say, I was listening to just an assortment of Johansen stuff, and I was listening again to Reach Out, their cover of Reach Out, I'll Be There.
Yeah.
Which I really enjoy his cover of, and just it shows his love of his Catholic universal taste. It's like, hey, this is a great song, and I'm gonna play it.
Yeah, and he had that with a lot of them. The version he did on that album, I don't think is as good as the version he was doing in '78 on his debut solo tour.
Mm-hmm.
It stretches out longer. That album, it's very slick. I don't like the mix on it at all. It's really weird how a live album, especially from a relatively under-the-radar artist, got to be so popular.
Yeah,
even on MTV and even on, classic rock or whatever they were calling FM radio back then.
Yeah.
I don't like the mix of the album, the sound of it, and they edit out all David's great. He's just a great raconteur. He has great rapport with his audience. He's got a big mouth, and he tells stories and makes jokes and actually talks. Speaks to the audience, not just, speaking above the audience. And that's all edited out. There's none of that on the Live It Up album, which in retrospect makes me think less of it. Although, God knows, I certainly listen to it a lot. But that version, his version of Reach Out, I'll Be There, that's just one of many. Like on the 1978 album that I was telling you about, from the Bottom Line, New York City, they cover... In one show, Reach Out, I'll Be There by the Four Tops, I Found a Love by Wilson Pickett's old band, the Falcons, Love Child by Diana Ross and the Supremes. Let's see... They actually break into, in the middle of Personality Crisis, the Doll song, and this was kind of a shtick they were doing on a tour. They just break the song down. You come to the end of the chorus, and the crowd's going nuts, waiting for the "and you're a prima ballerina" for the final verse. And they go into what was huge on the charts at the time, Bonnie Tyler's "It's a Heartache."
Oh,
remember that?
Sure.
It's actually a great song.
Yeah.
And they play that. They play like, a couple verses and a couple choruses of that, and then, stop and finish Personality Crisis. Just like, look, these guys they're having way too much fun, right?
Yeah.
It could be illegal. Or what other covers they do? Just from that show. I think maybe that's all of them. But the guy was always doing covers. On the Live It Up album, The Supremes is just what I get for loving you. And of course, when he turned into Buster Poindexter, forget about it. But he always had great taste in covers, not just any old covers. I mean, sometimes in the case of the Bonnie Tyler songs, like, what the hell, this is on the radio, this is at the top of the charts right now, let's play this song. Let's play it in the middle of a New York Dolls song.
Sure.
I want people to be alive. So then that's the end of David Joe's solo career. One more album would come out in 1984, Sweet Revenge. Nobody remembers it or anything. And frankly, it's an awful sounding record. It's everything bad about the 80s. Big, mechanical sounding, gated snare on the drums, buzzing, processed guitars, just loads of synthesizers and electronic keyboards. But the songs are there.
Yeah.
The short album, only 9 songs. The songs are there. The dude's voice, that big, somebody once described it as that big foghorn voice. And that's what his voice sounded like. And stinking rich, ain't working anymore. I mean, these are songs, King of Babylon, where he actually raps, he's not trying to be Grandmaster Flash, but, it's 1984, it's still a young genre. Hilarious, but the sound is regrettable. It's very high-tech.
Yeah.
1984 sound. You would have thought that with a sound like that and songs like that something would have got on the radio, but the perversity of the music industry, I guess, prevented that. Well, I guess after that, he quit drinking and took a year off or maybe a couple months off and reinvented himself as Buster Poindexter.
Yeah.
It would be 1987, after playing, several years, residencies in New York City at the Bottom Line every Thursday night, and other venues around New York City. They released their first album.
It sounds like it was kind of a slow evolution. I think it was some of the links you sent me, like you said, he was doing like a residency and eventually just came up with this alter ego where he could just be really more of himself in a way, play whatever he wanted, act the way he wanted to.
Well, yeah, he's got great stories about it. Apparently, Buster that's what his mom called him, Buster, as a little boy. Poindexter apparently became, what's the story he's telling? It's hilarious. He's always at the library, and so kids would see him at the library, and they call him Poindexter. And so he'd like have a book or the dictionary or something, but he'd have like a girly mag on the outside, whereas usually it's the outside. The opposite. You have, like a proper book, but then you have like the girly mag or whatever on the inside. But it was the opposite for David. And so, the other kids would start calling him Poindexter. So it was a name that apparently he'd used for many years. Indeed, his publishing, as of 1979, the songs on the In Style album are all, listed as Buster Poindexter Publishing.
Oh, okay.
1979. So, yeah, you like to describe it as, well, Buster, he's a character. He can get away with stuff that, I can't get away with,
They said part of why he did this, Poindexter, was to avoid fans of his music coming to the shows and asking for his old stuff. That's probably one reason. He covered, occasionally his own stuff. Well, on his debut album, he covers. And interestingly, I'd forgotten about this. Before the first album's release, he began appearing as part of the house band on Saturday Night Live.
Right. I only saw it a few times. Wasn't watching much TV in those days. But he'd sit in and, with the uptown horns, big flashy horn section. Yeah. We'd sit in, and they ended up playing with Buster Poindexter's band, Banshees of Blue. And something about Banshees of Blue, it should be noted that They acted almost as like a farm team, in baseball terms. Minor league team for the big, the major leagues to pick and choose from. Charlie Giordano, who first made his appearance on the Here Comes the Night tour and the Live It Up live album as a keyboard player, ended up taking Danny Federici's Hammond B3 spot in Springsteen's E Street Band when Danny died in 2007. Earlier than that, the Banshees' bass player, Tony Garnier, ended up being Dylan's bass player and to this day his musical band director. In the 1996 Time Out of Mind sessions. He's a good St. Paul boy by way of New Orleans. He was invited by Prince to join the Revolution early on, like 1980. And he said no, he's going to move to New York City to seek his family fortune. Well, it took him a couple years, but he ended up with Buster Poindexter and the Banshees of Blue, and ultimately with Mr. Dylan. Further, Susie Tyrell, who was Buster's foil, vocal foil. She didn't play, guitar or violin much with the Banshees of Blue, but she ended up joining the E Street Band as well. And
Patti Scialfa, I see, was in Buster's band.
Well, she was a big studio backing singer, so she sang backing on a lot of albums. She wasn't actually in the band, but she sang on at least the first album. But Susie Tyrell was, his mainstay foil. For roughly, 13 years and 4 albums that they were together. The first album, I think, is great. It's just very basic sound. It sounds great. The flavors are all over the shop. It's just hot, hot, hot became this huge single, which David, later several times said, "Oh, it's the bane of my existence." One hit wonder kind of thing. Probably sustained him. I don't know how he cut royalties because it's a cover of a band called Arrow or something. They're Caribbean. They're Jamaican, but it's he didn't write the song. I've never heard the original. So he wrote a couple songs and co-wrote a couple on the album, but otherwise it's Louis Armstrong with Mac Dab in the middle, House of the Rising Sun, doing Eric Burden and the Animals version. I guess David really liked Eric Burden, so he obviously covered and had some success with the live album doing the Animals medley. I'm not particularly impressed with that version, but he's got the voice. The thing is with Johansen, with David, is that it's the voice that counts, and it's more so than anybody I can think of other than, say, Otis Redding. It was just, the voice is there. Okay, this means something. Even if he's singing crap. And I can't say that about our great venerated poets, Bob Dylan with his several voices, or Lou Reed with his several voices, or Bowie with his several incarnations. Jagger's like the only one I can think of who's been consistent for 60 years. Springsteen, his voice is shaky. Well, he's still really, really strong, but he's had several vocal approaches. David Joe is the only guy I can think of where you hear him sing 2 words and oh, it's David Joe. What's he doing on this record?
Right.
Singing on somebody else's record, Garland Jeffries, Escape Artist album or whatever. So musically, the guy tried to make a living. He's tried for years to to make a living being a professional musician, and he did. As we can see, when he died, he was hurting for money and had to put out, not a GoFundMe, but, the Sweet Relief Foundation for musicians to cover expensive medical bills. That's, it's a travesty. It's a goddamn disgrace. But he tried everything that he could. The solo records. Now I'll be Buster Poindexter. I'll be this guy. I'll be Buster Poindexter. And the second Buster Poindexter album, Buster Goes Berserk, great title and great album cover, was not as, I don't know, the production, the mix is bad, the songs aren't there, kind of famous for his cover of Ray Charles' "Hit the Road Jack," which I think was on a movie soundtrack. He was doing movie parts, which she was uniformly hilarious just to watch.
Yeah.
Listen, even if the movie was crap, I think the Scrooge movie with Bill Murray that has a justifiable reputation.
Yeah.
Being hilarious. The third Buster Poindexter album, Buster's Happy Hour, that's his finest. It's great. It's a really raw, live in the studio sound. And they're all like drinking songs, post-World War II, jump blues, Louis Jordan, stuff like that. There's only one original, which is just gloriously hilarious. It's sort of a theatrical Bertolt Brecht, Kurt Weill thing called "The Worst Beer That I Ever Had." And he goes through all the beers of the world and the countries that they spawned them, and tells you why beer that he's drinking is really the worst beer he's ever had. Even though he'd been sober for several years by then. And, of course, covers, the Kinks or Ray Davies' Demon Alcohol on that album as well.
Mm-hmm.
The fourth album, I think 1998, Buster's Spanish Rocket Ship, is all original songs. And it's got a heavy Latin vibe to it. Again, same band, Banshees of Blue, and you can just hear how versatile these players are.
Yeah.
And it's just hysterically funny. But with these like really heavy mambo and samba, rhythms and flavors going on. Just like, wow. And then I guess after that, he just said, well, I don't know, he's going to grow his hair out and grow a beard, and got some players to form a group called the Harry Smiths.
Yeah.
And did 2 albums with them. One, David Johansen, the Harry Smiths, and then 2002, an album called Shaker. And Harry Smith, for those who don't know, is a famous American eccentric musicologist, record collector who compiled an album originally with 6 LPs, and I think released in maybe 68, 69, something like that, called the Harry Smith Anthology of American Folk Music, which is misleading because it's not really folk music. It's music that just didn't have a name. And so there's on CD, it's 6 CDs. On album, it's 12 vinyl or whatever, originally, whatever it was. And it's from old records, dating back to the mid-20s when they first started, recording audio, to probably the Second World War in the early and mid-40s. It's roughly the span of the Harry Smith Anthology of Folk Music. And everybody should have it in their record collection. I've had it like 3 times on CD. I don't currently own it. I think I sold it too.
And I'm well familiar with it. And
okay. Yeah. Sure.
The timing of it is correct. Makes sense because the big reissue of it came out in 1997.
That's roughly the time I bought it on CD. It came out in a big box set.
And same here. Yeah, that's when I got it, and I'm sure that's around when I got it. And that first Harry Smith record was 2000, so the timeline kind of fits.
Right. I don't know if there was, a folk revival or whatever, going on in the zeitgeist. I'm still playing in bands at the time, but...
I think just that anthology of American folk music there was a lot of publicity around when it was reissued.
Sure, that's right. Yeah, it had a great big fat booklet with contemporary artists, Elvis Costello or whatever, giving their impressions.
And there, remember there was like the Americana, kind of folk rock movement, and so that kind of stuff was going on.
Sure. Tupelo and
exactly Wilco,
Whiskey Town and Wilco and
you got it.
Jayhawks. Right. That was a big time for that.
Sunvolt,
Americana.
Yeah.
Right. Okay, good. No, that's good observation. Yeah. probably one of the things that, Johansen had in mind. Like, wow, there's this resurgent interest, in the popular culture, or at least the popular culture of, like, real music people.
Yeah.
This thing we're calling Americana. So, well, yeah, I love a lot of this stuff. Well, I'll record that. Now,
Yeah.
he recorded both albums in a big church in New York City, just for the sound. And they're both, just great sounding, albums. Very, just all acoustic, upright bass, drummer just playing brushes and mostly, snare. Just great sounding albums. But, the main thing is David's voice, interpreting. Well, of the people, the well-known people, Son House, Muddy Waters from the second album, St. James Alley, a couple of the songs from the actual anthology of folk music, Mississippi John Hurt's Richland Woman, which supposedly the Dolls used to play.
Ah.
The original Dolls, and I've never heard a recording or even a reference to it. But it's, Mississippi John Hurt, he had this very gentle approach. Uh-huh. But it's just, such a beautiful song. It's very quiet. That's the last song on the first Harry Smith album. And then, I guess around 2002, something like 2003, Morrissey, I know you're a big fan, and I am not such a big fan. The man from the Smiths, who'd been a lifelong Dolls devotee, and ran a New York Dolls, fanzine in the UK during the 70s. Somehow convinced David and Sylvain to get together with Arthur Kane, who'd been living in L.A. for several years, and to do a New York Dolls reformation. And Arthur had always wanted it. He was the only one of the Dolls who never had an outside musical project. He had a brief thing, a band called the Corpse Grinders. I had a 45 of theirs. I don't even think he sang on it. It was just, I don't know, just sludgy, just forgettable. Yeah. I couldn't remember what it sounded like. But all the rest of the Dolls had, solo careers and endeavors, which were, almost uniformly just, invigorating and exciting. At least to hear what they're going to do next. Even Johnny Thunder is like unfortunate pastimes and bad habits. It's always exciting to hear, a new bootleg or something. The legend goes that, my impression, I don't know if it's legend or apocryphal, but it's my impression is that David was the one who never wanted to reform the Dolls in their lifetime when they were still alive. Johnny died in 1991 at the age of 38. Jerry died less than a year later, 92. My impression had been through the years, the few times you'd actually hear about it, because there was no internet back then, obviously, is that it was David who didn't want to do it. And so he's probably, kind of like Jagger in that respect, didn't like to look back, always wanted to be moving forward or whatever. Well, the Dolls had, without David, had appeared with each other and played with each other on stage. Sylvain obviously was playing with David on stage and on record from the get-go, from David's first solo album. Jerry Nolan and Johnny Thunders formed the Heartbreakers, originally with Richard Hell, and then Hell left. They had their own thing, and later on, Sylvain did a tour with Johnny and Jerry as filling in for Walter Lure from the Heartbreakers on a tour of Sweden, where Johnny and Jerry were actually both living at the same time and both pretty much clean, just on methadone, and both had like girlfriends there. And the tapes I've heard from that tour are just wonderful. It's because Billy Rath himself, he's a great bass player, much better than Arthur Kane. So it's like the Dolls, except with a really good bass player. So they didn't sing much except backing vocals, and oddly enough was playing a Telecaster, which is very un-New York Dolls. So I always said, nah, the Dolls are a Gibson band. And that's pretty much true. But then Arthur appeared with Johnny and Jerry in '88, and I think a very, very fine audience, one camera, video, and CD recording at the Roxy in L.A. Really together, really professional. Johnny does a lot of blues. He must have been, pretty clean at the point, or at least, methadone. And there's some tapes where David show up. There's at least one bootleg I have where he shows up for a few songs with Johnny, and Sylvain shows up as well. So, but they never actually got together, the Dolls, again, until this. It's called the Meltdown Festival in London in 2004 that Morrissey was the curator of, and David agreed, Sylvain, of course, and it was Arthur's dream to finally get the Dolls. And Arthur, by this time, it had been really hard times, really bad alcohol, kicked the alcohol, joined the Mormon church, became just like a drone employee at their famous ancestry department, and must have kept playing somehow. Apparently, he hawked or pawned or sold all his bass guitars. They played 2 shows and recorded one and filmed it and released on CD and DVD. Brilliant, wonderful sound, and Arthur's fine. He even gets some of his, little cool bass runs in, and it's all Dolls material from their 2 albums.
And this is around the time that documentary was made that kind of has its centerpiece trying to get Arthur Kane back into playing bass rescued from the Mormon Church for this Meltdown Festival, right?
Well, yeah, that film was called New York Doll.
Right.
It's a very well done film. It's actually, I think the director was a Mormon himself, and it's a very sweet film and very simple, empathetic. Yeah. It's not judgmental, and you meet some of Arthur's co-workers, and they just love Arthur.
Yeah.
Arthur's he's just a weird, really big guy. Apparently he's like 6'5", and it's really high voice with a Bronx accent. And it's a very, even if you're not into, the Dolls or even rock and roll or whatever, it's a very sweet movie.
Yeah.
So they did these 2 shows, I think one more show at the Meltdown Festival, and I think they did one maybe in Manchester or something. And literally, like 3 weeks later, Arthur admitted himself to the hospital. I don't know if it's in the UK or back in the US, and just died immediately.
Wow.
Leukemia.
Yeah. Which,
Johnny Thunders had advanced leukemia when he died in New Orleans in '91. It's still, great, debates over, was it an OD?
Yeah.
Was it robbery? Was it, New Orleans police closed the case. They weren't interested. He said it's a New York junkie.
Yeah.
We don't care. So that's, heartening but tragic comic tale of how the Dolls got together for their second life. Well, they got a couple more guys. They got, originally Gary Powell from the Libertines was the drummer for those 2 festival shows. And you can tell he doesn't really know the material that well. Fine, energetic drummer. But they got Brian Delaney on drums, the New York City guys, Sammy Yaffa from a band called Hanoi Rocks, were supposedly, one of these kind of like, Sig Sputnik or whatever, Tony James from Generation X's 80s band, kind of glammy, hard, hair metal bands. I don't know what they're like. I don't know. I've never actually heard.
Well, they're not bad. I remember liking, they're a lot better than your average hair metal band because they had kind of a little bit of a punk edge to them.
Is this Hanoi Rocks or Sig Sputnik you're talking about?
We're talking about Hanoi Rocks.
Oh, okay, yeah. Well, okay, so Sammy Yaffa's a bass player, and he's, very, very good bass player. And they got a guy named Steve Conti on guitar. He's been around forever. I think he has a brother, and they've both, been, guys on the East Coast scene forever. And He's got the look. He actually looks just like Joe Perry from Aerosmith. He's a good player. It's a good thing he doesn't try and actually sound like Johnny Thunders, because nobody's ever sounded like Johnny Thunders. Even Sil Sylvain, who taught Johnny to play guitar, supposedly. Yeah. Johnny was a bass player before, forming Actress in 71. Even Sylvain can't cut Johnny's sound. They ended up being, they released 3 albums from 2006 to 2011. And it's a whole, if you think of them just as Johansen albums, with Sylvain, who's a very, very good guitar player, far more interesting, I think, than Steve Conte, who's ostensibly the lead guitar player. But Sylvain could do leads and solos, all that stuff as well. If you just think of them as Johansen album, that's legitimate. That's a legitimate thing. Yeah. But the way he's writing, you asked earlier, did David really write songs? It's the New York Dolls are an idea. They're an idea. The New York Dolls are not Johnny Thunders and Jerry Nolan necessarily, sonically. Yeah. They're an idea. There's a thing that Robert Christgau wrote about for probably in the Village Voice, but it's on his website. Yeah, and he gave the first 2 Dolls albums A+, but he also gave this album with the brilliant title. It's kind of a mouthful, but One Day It Will Please Us to Remember Even This is the name of the album. Yeah. Christgau, let me just read this briefly. David Johansen is no longer 24, so this reunion album surprises by revealing dirty little secret beneath the 70s Dolls' playful pansexuality, religious emotion. That's what it's like. That's what it's like. They actually believed like what they were doing was the Lord's work. And it's actually more apparent and far has 38 years of David and Sil coming to terms with what it's like to be a human being in the 21st century.
Yeah, I think it's a great record. I loved it when it came out. I loved it. I like re-listening to it. As opposed to the album that came out after that, I thought was pretty weak, lyrically and musically. I haven't really listened to that third one that came out in 2011. Is that one any good? Dancing Backwards?
Great. Well, I think the second one's great, too. I don't think it's as brilliant. It's thematically, there's, say, more Buddhism and Taoism. David was adherent of both. He described himself as a Catholic Taoist, of course, in the same way Kurt Vonnegut described himself as a Christian atheist. But he's, a Buddhist as well, and that's more apparent lyrically on the second album from 2009 called "'Cause I Said So," name of the album, which Todd Rundgren produced that at his new studio in Hawaii. And musically, some of the songs, the rockers have a more R&B kind of blues, Stonesy kind of drive to them. If you think it's weak, we'll just agree to disagree. As surprising as One Day It Will Please Us to Remember This, no, because nobody had any right to expect a reunion album of one of the 2 or 3 greatest rock and roll bands ever of all time to come up with a reunion album 38 years later with only 2 original members. Be that astonishing. And contemporary sounding. It's a very hard rock sounding sound. The Dolls band, the the Second Life Dolls. It's more rock than rock and roll. And really, that's down to Brian Delaney, drummer, very punchy, modern, very wonderful drummer, and Sammy Alpha, the bass player, and probably, to me, the least interesting member, Steve Conte on guitar. It just can't be stated how much Jerry Nolan and Johnny Thunders were responsible for the atmosphere of the original Dolls, sonically and propulsively. The third album, Dancing Backwards in High Heels, nobody seems to like. To me, it's a completely different sound. It actually sounds like it was recorded maybe in 1963. And the producer is a guy named
Jason Hill.
Jason Hill. And he plays bass on it. And apparently he was like a guitar player in a band called Louis the 13th or something like that. Louis the 14th, referencing one of the French kings. He's a good bass player, very good bass player. He played some live as well. Steve Conti quit the band, and they recruited Frank Infanti from Blondie as second guitar, along with Sylvain. But the guitars are kind of downplayed, and Sylvain plays a lot more keyboards. He was always a great keyboard player, even with the Dolls, play piano with them. But he plays a lot of, say, Vox Farfisa organ on this, just like it's 1963. And his harmony vocal arrangements, pretty much all by himself, overdubbed.
An interesting piece of trivia. In 2006, David Bowie personally asked Hill and Louis XIV to share the stage with him for his final live performance at an AIDS charity event called Black Ball in New York City.
What year?
2006.
2006. Oh, yeah, because that must have been right around the time Bowie had just, he'd had a heart attack, a mild heart attack on stage in Germany.
Well, that was like 2004 during his tour, and then he had retired from touring,
right?
And he came back and did this weird arty performance where like he had a fake black eye and his arm was in a sling. I think that's when he did this performance.
Oh, I've seen pictures of him in that getup. Yeah. Oh, I didn't know about that, because then it would take another. When did the next day come out? That album, like 2013 or something, and it was like no promotion or anything. The band were all had to sign non-disclosure agreements and couldn't talk about it, and just like
that's
showed
right,
up
yeah,
out of nowhere.
Yeah, that was 2013.
Yeah, and of course it was a really, really great album.
It was, yeah.
It had no business being that great, but because he'd more or less retired. No, I didn't know that. I've never actually heard Louis XIV.
I haven't either.
On the deluxe version of the album, Dancing Backwards in High Heels, there's a DVD, a making of DVD of the album. Okay. They recorded in Newcastle in England. There's a making of DVD as well for the first album, which is really, really great. Mm-hmm. I sent you a link to it. I don't know if you saw it. But there's a great scene, David Frick from, the Rolling Stones music editor for Rolling Stone magazine, talking to David, in the studio for the One Day It Will Please Us album. And David's talking about, this whole thing about, proto-punk and the influencing punk rock and all that. Yeah. I don't know. It's just, it's kind of like the whole sexuality of the thing. It's just like, it's so old and hackneyed. Just, okay, yeah, they did the thing, and then it sounded like the thing that came later. David's talking to David Frick, and he says, so many of these, punk bands, they were just, they're angry, and they're just kind of negative, and it doesn't name any name. I'm assuming he's not, talking about the Clash, or at least what the Clash became. But they're just, it's just, well, I'm paraphrasing. Maybe it's like they're a bummer. They're, it's a negative, downer. He said the thing with the Dolls is we're always like into stuff. We were excited about stuff. I'm paraphrasing, but clothing, cool. Groovy, clothes that they'd wear, or whatever, playing, discovering, cool covers to play, just being into stuff. These are very young men from the outer boroughs of New York City. I mean, that's the suburbs of New York City. That's kind of my kind of final word on what the Dolls and the legacy is that they were into stuff.
Yeah.
And David Johansen was into stuff. He was into life. He was into...
it wasn't the nihilism of punk. It was more like life-affirming.
Yeah, and you get that in the music, and composition of the songs, of the lyrics, and just lyrically, those last three Dolls albums. You listen to what the man has to say, and it's like, to me, like reading a Kurt Vonnegut novel. It's like he can make you laugh and cry and think, all in one sentence, or in the case of a lyric, in one couplet. It's warm. It feels good. It's like, God, I'm so glad there's another person on the planet who feels this way.
Yeah.
And they happen to sing like this.
Just a big voice.
Yeah. I remember one of the times, I only saw them 3 times. First time with the Clash, opening for the Clash in 79, which is 2 months before London Calling was released. And Clash actually played like 6 songs from London Calling, which nobody knew because it hadn't been released yet. But after that, it was once at Duffy's and became Norma Jean's, and I think it's still something now, 26th and 26th in Minneapolis. But Duffy's is a big club for, new music.
Yeah.
David and a couple of the other guys, maybe Sylvain, they had these huge cowboy hats. I mean, huge, so they're like big styrofoam or whatever hats. I was like, what's this coming from? What's going on with that? At the time, I don't know if you remember this, but a lot of the brethren, a lot of black dudes were wearing cowboy hats in the early 80s. It was like a style thing or fashion thing.
Okay.
Urban black dudes.
Yeah.
It was a thing. You got to, if you don't remember, I'm not making this up.
Yeah.
And so I don't know what it was about, but then I saw him a third time at the old St. Paul Civic Center, and it was opening for Pat Benatar. I bought the ticket just to see David Joe. He did a big tour with Pat Benatar. And I saw the show. I stayed for, 2 songs of Pat Benatar and said, I left.
Here's a related trivia question. I see that Johansen opened for The Who at several East Coast concerts, including Shea Stadium in 1982.
Opening for the Clash, who were opening for The Who.
Well, exactly. So my question is, maybe there were multiple opening acts. Like, it could have been David Johansen and then The Clash and then The Who kind of thing.
Well, David Joe was touring with Pat Benatar that year, 82. That's, the year that Live It Up came out. And so those were just the 2 Shea Stadium shows. The Who played with the Clash opening were just one-off events. Because the Clash were on tour, touring Combat Rock at the time also. I saw them that August. And, the Shea Stadium album that was, released a few years ago was recorded in like October or something. Both David Joe and the Clash were on their own tours at the time, as the Who were.
Yeah.
So that just, I don't know how many shows that the Clash opened for the Who or that David Joe opened for the Clash and the Who. I'm guessing probably not many.
Yeah, I mean, it could have just been Shea Stadium, but we know it's just interesting. We know for a fact that the Clash opened for the Who at Shea Stadium in 1982. There's an album to prove it. So if David Joe also opened for the Who in Shea Stadium in the same year, it must have been like one of those like bills like they had in the 60s where like multiple bands were playing, not just 2.
Yeah, I mean, it's like the dude couldn't get a break, I mean, he opened for the Clash in 79 as well. I don't know how many shows on the tour. Bo Diddley was also opening for the Clash in 79 on some shows. How the music industry operates, now, but even back then, I thought I had an understanding, but no, I don't. But why is David Johansen opening for Pat Benatar for almost an entire tour? What's up with that? He wasn't headlining. He had this, that's where the album came out, the Live It Up album, came out of that tour. I think he was headlining those shows. He did several nights at the Paradise Theater in Boston, and that's where the Live It Up album was recorded.
Yeah. Now, one more David Johansen question, kind of put a bow on this thing. I noticed that in the year 2020, Martin Scorsese did a feature film on David Johansen called Personality Crisis, One Night Only, which came out in 2023. I'd love to see it. I haven't seen it. Have you seen it?
Yeah, I can't give you a definite answer. Okay. I've seen parts of it.
Okay.
I'm inclined to think maybe I did see it, but like wasn't. I've seen a lot of scenes from it.
Yeah.
But it's like, I can't, I was aware of it, when it came out and everything. And I think I don't know if it's been released on DVD, probably. But it's probably available on the Prime and Netflix or whatever.
It came out on Showtime, but I think it would be great to see because it's kind of a nice fitting, end bookmark or end mark because it was made relatively recently. And Scorsese always does an excellent job. Think about the stuff he did for Dylan.
Scorsese, he likes music a whole lot. I guess I'm just going to say one last thing. And for me, I guess this will wrap it up. You remember, like, when you were a kid, when you were a child, like, pre-adolescent, toys, your favorite toys?
Yeah.
They really meant a lot to you. They were little, but for some reason, they meant a lot to you. And maybe a little later, it became like baseball cards, football cards, and they meant a lot to you too, if you were into that, collecting. But toys is what I'm getting at. And they're like kind of your world, your own your little private world.
Yeah.
And that's what the New York Dolls represent to me. And by the New York Dolls, I mean David Johansen's solo work, his Buster Poindexter work, and his work with the Harry Smiths of the Second Life of the New York Dolls. It also means Johnny Thunders and his work, Bill Sylvain. Primarily, we talk about those first two New York Dolls albums.
Yeah.
They're like my favorite toys.
Yeah.
And they still feel like that. Just like they're tactile. They mean something. They mean something to me philosophically. They mean something to me as far as fun. They make me want to jump up and down. They make me want to go outside and play in the sandbox. Walk around my neighborhood like I just did today, going to the library. That for me is an old guy's version of playing in the sandbox.
Yeah.
And those words, those phrases that come out in those lyrics with that voice, and then those voices in the background doing harmonies and stuff, and just the sonic, the buzzsaw guitar and the other clean, funky sounding guitar, and the drums that you can't sit down, as the old soul song said. You can't sit down,
Yeah.
That's what the Dolls mean to me. That's what Dave Johansen he was kind of like my thing.
Yeah.
Before, like, the Stones were always my favorite band, but then the Clash came along and they became my pet band like that. But they're still, they were British dudes, and there was still stuff that I didn't understand. I was just getting into reggae at the time, and they brought in all kinds of different weird, perverse hybrids of music, on the Sand and East album and the Combat Rock album.
Yeah.
But the Dolls had this thing, this clean, classic sense of songwriting.
Yeah. And
just everything, the verbiage. I mean, they're like my favorite toys.
Yeah.
And I still like them.
Yeah.
Or like a candy bar, like a Snickers bar or a Three Musketeers bar or something. It's like, it might make your teeth rot and fall out, but boy, it sure tastes good.
Yeah, and it's like all great art, it ages well. You hear those first two Dolls records, and they could have been recorded. You can't tell when they were recorded, and that's a mark of great art.
Excellent point. Excellent point. You really can't tell. Not from the production, whatever that means, mixing. You can't really tell when they were recorded. They don't sound like any particular time or place.
Right.
And by God, they could have been recorded, 2 hours ago by some band in, I don't know, Oklahoma City, Pensacola, upstate New York, and Buffalo. I don't know.
Yeah.
Who knows? But it does have that timeless quality. Sonically, the way the guitars are playing, the way the drums go, and the rhythm, they don't sound, they're coming from an old tradition. They were coming from an old tradition back in 73 and 74. Somehow it sounds still like, it sounds now. It sounds now. And the themes. Man, we're just in love with love, you know? It's like, what's that first song on the One Day It Will Please Us to Remember Even This album, you know? Yeah, jumping around the stage like teenage girls, you know? It's ferociously courageous. Like, I'm talking about LUV, and that's the thing. That's the dirty little secret of the Dolls, is, as Chris Gaw said, religious emotion. I just call it LUV, you know? Just love. Be alive. Be alive. Be alive. Be into stuff. They made you dance. They made you dance.
Sure.
You know, that's that. Rest in peace, David Johansen.
Yeah, one of the greats.
You're the man. Yeah. One of them. Yeah, he's one of them. He's up there. Always has been. You know me, Jed. You know me. You know I've always loved that stuff. Not just because he died.
Oh yeah.
You know, I've always loved his stuff. Yeah. I paid in real time every time he or Sylvain or Johnny Thunder put out a record. Yeah, I got all kinds of that stuff in my collection.
Yeah, no doubt.
It makes me feel good. Johnny had bad habits and bad attitudes a lot of the time, but just for sonically, for kicks, just sonic kicks for just pure music, you know, he was great that way. But David, you know, David Joe, especially as an older guy, you're not supposed to get, when you're older, you're supposed to get boring and jaded and stupid and repetitive. You're not supposed to turn to some like Taoist, Buddhist, you know, soothsayer, shaman, which is exactly what David did when the Dolls reformed for 3 albums. Jed, I suggest strongly that you listen to the second and third Dolls albums. Second and third, you know, the Dolls reunion albums.
But I'll re-listen to it, and I haven't heard the third one yet.
And of course they do, you know, a reggae version of Trash at the end of the album too.
Yeah, I did kind of like that, I have to say.
Did you see the making of documentary for the first album?
No, I think I had seen it before, like when the album came out, but I didn't watch it recently. No.
Okay, yeah, I just think it's really joyous just watching, you know, how the band interacts and
I'll have to rewatch it.
Interviews that David Frick does, you know, in the studio, and there's just especially, you know, when you get like, you know, David and Syl interacting, it just, you know, Sylvain's just, he's like a big kid. He's like a big 14-year-old. You know, it's hilarious. You know, talk about the guitar. It's like he's playing this obviously new Rickenbacker. It's, you know, kind of this cool pale blue with a white pickguard. They're working on what's the song? Take a look at my good looks. Yeah, great album, a great song, and but it's kind of got the feel of. And David comes in, he's going, oh, and like, don't stonesify it so much. And Phil's like, what? And they're like, no, when are you doing your pinky on that string right there? And so like that. And so it's like, I could stonesify it if I want. And he like immediately goes into like, you know, Beast of Burden, right?
Yeah.
I was just flawlessly like, that's the Stones, right? With my pinky here. And it's just like these guys are just, you know, total, you know, music geeks, you know?
Yeah.
It's just like this little scene, you know, off the cuff scene, and wonderful, beautiful song. And rocks. Okay, man. If you want to wrap it up, or if you got anything further to add to?
No, I think that pretty much wraps it up. So this is a nice time to kind of wrap it up. But good convo on David.
Think about all that cool stuff that there is to think about.
Yeah. All right.
As David said, be into stuff. So there you go.
Yeah. May we both continue to be into stuff.
Yeah, right on, baby.
Well, that's our drop on David Johansen, an artist who moved through eras with style, substance, and a storyteller's heart. His mark is everywhere if you know where to listen. Thanks for joining us today, and we'll see you next time on Culture Drop.